So without any further ado, allow me to introduce our speaker. Nadine Hubbs is a historian, musicologist, and professor at the University of Michigan. She writes and speaks on a wide range of musical subjects and has published 2 books, The Queer Composition of America's Sound and Rednecks, Queers, and Country Music, and an edited collection, Uncharted Country, New Voices and Perspectives in Country Music Studies. Her media works has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, NPR, BBC, and the Dolly Parton's America podcast, as well as many other outlets. She is currently writing a book entitled Border Country, Mexico, America, and Country Music. Let's give a big welcome to Dean. Yeah!
Thank you. It's telling me it needs to identify my keyboard. Sorry, folks, I'm just... Does that make sense to you?
It does. It thinks the clicker is a keyboard.
Okay. That wouldn't occur to me, but I'm sure it's a more sophisticated conclusion. And I need to go to presenter view before we actually go. Yeah, great.
And then I'm just going to do real quick. Bam, that worked. Okay, so thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Yes. Okay, folks. Thanks very much to Jacob and the organizing team, to the expert tech folks back in the booth, and to all of you for being here tonight. I'm really delighted to be part of the Big Gay Read, and when Jacob reached out to me and asked me if I would do this as part of this summer's Big Gay Read, I just said, heck yeah. I don't even know what you want me to do, but I will do it for the Big Gay Read. And now that he had to mention Pink Pony Club so that that song is bouncing through my head, and probably everyone's, I will try to get on nevertheless. I am talking about the Wild West today, which is a subject that you might think, oh yeah, you've written books on country music, so it makes sense maybe that you would talk about the Wild West. I haven't been talking about the Wild West or researching the Wild West until my most recent, my current book in progress, which is titled Border Country, The Mexican Influence at the Heart of Country Music. So that's what really got me into the Western of what used to be called country and Western. So I'm going to expand much broader beyond what I've been researching for this talk tonight in order to connect up with Sarah Gailey's novella, which the first thing I did once Jacob told me about this Big Gay Read series was ask him, okay, could you reserve the book under my name? And I came and picked it up and read it. So I know that some of you probably haven't yet, and I will assiduously avoid any spoilers. So don't worry. But this is why we're talking about the West. This is why I'm talking about the Wild West, because Sarah Gailey's novella, Upright Women Wanted, is set in the post-apocalyptic West and involves a roaming band of queer, non-binary people and women who are roaming on horseback, pulling wagons, and toting guns, are armed in this, imagine, fascist landscape. It's set in the near future, and she published it in 2020, presciently. So, you know, I thought one thing that someone might wonder reading this novella would be, okay, what do queer librarians have to do with Wild West folks riding horses and packing heat? Aren't those things sort of at opposite ends of the cultural imaginary? So I already kind of knew the answer to that, which is no, they're not at opposite ends of the cultural imaginary. And I'm going to talk about why, with reference to the future, the present, and the past. And so I'm saying that this is the Wild West in 4 acts. Starting with the Wild West future. Near future, Gailey sets this novella. She shows, again, none of this will be a spoiler. She shows in this novella that things kind of revert to Wild West conditions under fascism set in the near future. Women and non-binary folk who are secretly queer, because we're in a bit of a kind of Handmaid's Tale scenario. So these women and non-binary assigned female at birth folk are secretly queer, traveling on horses in the actual American West as armed, courageous, and very independent anti-fascist outlaws. Now, all this might seem very fantasy fiction. And we might ask, did this supposedly ultra, uber American space that we think of as one of the spaces that really formed us as a nation and as a culture, the Wild West, did it indeed include women as full humans? Did it include Black, Indigenous, people of color who do feature in the novella, LGBTQ folk? Or was it all just macho, straight, white cis men, like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood? So does Sarah Gailey's, and what a great name, post-apocalyptic Wild West bear any resemblance to the classic American Wild West of about 175 years ago, say circa 1850? Or are brave, independent, queer, and of color women and AFAB people merely the invention of this queer fantasy fiction writer and her heated imagination? Okay, and then the thing happens where your cursor is on that screen and not on your own screen. Okay. So, another question I would plant in your minds before I dive in is a really important one, and one that all of you as readers might engage. What are the effects of seeing people like ourselves in this legendary uber American landscape, maybe for the first time ever? And you're going to see more of them starting now. And this is a piece in The Conversation, the online magazine, by my colleagues at West, Rebecca Schofield and Alyssa Ford. They're scholars who study rural queers and the history of the cowboy in the American West. They have done oral history with participants in IGRA, the International Gay Rodeo Association. They point out that, quote, cowboys were once the outcasts of Victorian American society. They tended to be poor nomads, and ranch work and cattle drives attracted a racially diverse workforce, including Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and Chinese residents of the American West. And I have seen that the figure is 25% at certain points for Black cowboys, among all cowboys. IGRA, International Gay Rodeo Association, formed in the 1970s and 80s. First in the 70s, in response to a need to create a home-like space for queer rural folk who had followed that metronormative imperative that says, if you're queer, you must move to a big city if you want to actually have a real queer life. and then found that they really missed the rural spaces, they missed the animals, they missed the community. And then in the 80s, IGRA became more formally organized and took its name. And when the HIV/AIDS crisis came along in the 1980s, IGRA members responded to the death and loss in their communities. And I have attended IGRA rodeos. Back in the 2000s, I attended one in St. Louis, and I attended another one in Chicago. They tend to be located right outside the city. And we had one that year also in Detroit, but I didn't make it to that one. And having attended the IGRA rodeos, I would point out a few of the highlights that I liked best. One is that IGRA's rodeo clowns are drag queens. And as you might guess, they don't tend to be glamour queens. They are bad drag and funny queens, often, as we might imagine. Also, unlike in straight rodeos, IGRA rodeos allow women to compete in every event, not just those events deemed easy or safe or ladylike. That's completely different from non-queer rodeo. And country dancing, line dancing, two-step, is hot every night at an IGRA rodeo weekend. Many of the sharpest dancers are Black and Hispanic folk, and the rodeo is much less whitewashed at IGRA events than it is at straight rodeos. One more thing I would note, I was there researching country music, and so the dancing and music, it was all country music for dancing, was important to me. And also this, there are vendors who set up tents, and they sell cowboy hats. Felt cowboy hats, mostly the cheaper straw, cool weather hats. And they are each named by the vendors according to the country stars who wear them. So you had your Garth hat, you had your Reba hat, you had your Clint Black, et cetera, et cetera. Because there are really a dazzling array of different shapes and designs of cowboy hats. So these beautiful photographs, they included in their article How Gay Rodeos Upend Assumptions About Life in Rural America. And they are by a photographer named Luke Guilford, who was exhibiting, who first exhibited these photos all together in 2019. And here are a few more of them. There's one of the rodeo queens. Finally, we see a woman competitor, grand entry in Texas. And then that beautiful shot of lovers from Alberta. So the authors, Schofield and Ford, write of what they call the fantasy of the straight white cowboy. And they note, quote, by the 50s and 60s, movie westerns featured actors like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. Nearly all of these depictions portrayed the cowboy as white, straight, and male. Black and indigenous cowboys, as well as women riders, gradually disappeared from the national imagination. So, I want to ask now, where did this fantasy of the straight white cowboy come from? And that's not a rhetorical question, that's a historical question. Here's where that fantasy came from. The Wild West past. Most of all, Buffalo Bill gave us our current notions of not only the cowboy, but what we call the West. And what I will be arguing in my book that I'm finishing up this year, in the coming academic year, so by next summer I hope to have finished, this book on the Mexican influence at the heart of country music. It turns out it's really, really at the heart, because what I'm going to be arguing is, you know that whole schmear we call the West? That's just the word we came up with as a quick and dirty synonym for Mexican. After we stole over 50% of Mexico's territory from them in the 19th century, and then appropriated all the culture and gear of this figure we call the cowboy. So, where we got our ideas about the Wild West, and where do we get our ideas about who was there, playing what role, doing what? Well, let's start with what the West meant before we had the Mexican-American War, we call it. Mexicans have a different name for it. They call it, you know, the invasion of the Americans, basically. But before that happened, in the 1830s and 1840s, when you would say West in America, you would be referring to maybe Illinois. You would be referring to Ohio. Eventually, a few years later, you think of those of you who are readers, Willa Cather. Then you're talking about Nebraska, right? Well, what does that come from? That comes from the frontier expanding always westward in the United States, right? We started in the colonies on the East Coast. West was the only place we had to go as land-dwelling creatures. We didn't go into the Atlantic Ocean. So, we have this romantic American notion. There's manifest destiny, which is, right, like that it was a divine destiny that we would take over all this territory. I don't even get into that craziness. But we still have this romantic American notion about the West. It was a moving target, started in such a banal place as Ohio. I can say that because it's my home state. And that stays in this room, and anyone who watches the live stream. You think how romantic that notion is. How many songs have the title or a lyric about westbound train, right? Even to send a train in the western direction rather than the eastern direction already makes it romantic. And so the West eventually settled in on this notion, which was not Ohio, which was not Nebraska, which was not Illinois. And that happened. Oh, before I leave this slide, let me point out all the bling that came from Mexico. It's 100%. I'd have to point it to every single thing in this photo, except I do want to also distinguish that his buckskin fringed coat, apparently that fringe helps. I should have one now because I'm probably going to ride my bike home in the rain. It helps the rain go away from your body. It's actually quite functional as well as being ornamental. But that was indigenous. And indigenous Mexican people wore these. This we now call chaps. That's a shortening of the Spanish word. I think it's chaparrales. This you can't see underneath, but it's embroidered, and we'll see more photos of the embroidered cowboy shirt that we think of as Western wear. All of it was Mexican. The cowboy himself and herself were Mexican. The entire world thinks of the cowboy as an American icon. The cowboy is Mexican. And moreover, we Americans didn't even start to adopt or absorb or appropriate this figure into our culture, really until Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And when was that? Pretty recently, the 1880s. Historically speaking, that's pretty recent, especially when you consider that the cowboy culture and all the roping tricks and these fancy saddles, I mean, this all has a lot of incredible functionality in it. And the reason Buffalo Bill became so famous is because he learned roping tricks, lassoing tricks, riding tricks. All of it was Mexican. It all belonged to a Mexican, well, it's a UNESCO recognized set of cultural properties that is called charreria. And we'll talk about charro, the person who does it, the cowboy who does it. But all those tricks for herding cows, and also, you know, rodeo tricks that really go above and beyond just herding cows, or riding a bull or whatever, and the gear to do it, all of it came from Mexican culture that had been developing for 350 years by the time Buffalo Bill introduced it to the world and to America through his Wild West show, starting in the 1880s. Now, we should dip into this a bit. Before 1848, this is how much of our territory was not ours, but was Mexico's. And how much of their territory that constituted, I've already said, 55%. In our notion of Western expansion and manifest destiny, we seized the land from Texas west to California. It's now known as the US Southwest. And it became known as the West, and the cultures that we got from there have everything to do with, well, also what I'm wearing. Western wear, you know, the pearl snap shirt, the Western yoke, the cowboy boots. I don't have like an authentic buckle, but all of that comes directly from Mexican cowboy culture, what we now call Western, and the world thinks of as American. So through this Wild West show, the cowboy emerged as a popular US figure. In the mid to late 1880s, first emerged as part of his Wild West show and its many knockoff imitators touring the United States and Europe in the 1880s through the 19-teens. The American heritage of the Wild West frontier, as represented by Buffalo Bill in his roping, riding, and shooting shows and contests, was, in fact, as I say, a collection of Mexican traditions that had been developed for some 350 years in Mexico. And indeed, in the show, Buffalo Bill appeared in all of these Mexican outfits. He was quite a clothes horse as well as a horse rider. Very beautiful hand-embroidered shirts. All of this is Mexican and Indigenous vaquero and charro clothing. The design of the saddle and the saddle horn and all that leather work, the fancy tooling, it all came from Mexican cowboy culture. The rodeo itself, of course, rodeo is a Spanish word, came from Mexico. Not only the competition and show aspect, but the parties, the food, the dancing through the night became then the American rodeo. This was so huge, such a late 19th century pop culture craze, that Buffalo Bill Cody was the most famous American in the world by 1889. And the cowboy who had been, and I mentioned earlier, he was kind of an outcast of society doing undesirable work and a nomad, a wanderer, went from being a kind of disreputable figure, cowboy was a term of insult, in 1883 when this show first opened, he became a popular figure and a symbol of the nation. So there was no mass media in the 1880s, 1890s, but that's pretty fast transformation. So then it got musical, because everybody wanted to get in on the cowboy craze, of course. Now, the most respected country music scholars in the field have said the cowboy contributed absolutely nothing to music. However, cowboy songs and singing cowboys contributed countless records, gifts under the Christmas tree, lots and lots of Americana culture. It's just that their songs weren't particularly anything new. And in fact, if we get back to the subject of country music, they were basically country songs sung by people in hats, right? But John Lomax, and he and his son Alan Lomax are very, very famous music collectors, right? Folklorists. Well, in 1910, he took the cowboy craze musical. In this case, it was a book of notated songs, not yet records. And these are some songs we know: Down in the Valley, Home on the Range. Cowboy's Lament might not sound familiar, but if you know The Streets of Laredo, that beautiful Marty Robbins song, from way back in 1960, you know Cowboy's Lament. You know these folk songs came up under different titles with different lyrics all the time. So, in the 1930s, Hollywood went all in on the singing cowboy. And the first big star was Gene Autry. This was starting up in the late 1920s. Well, at that point, Gene Autry was a very young man in his early 20s, and he was working in Chicago, because Nashville was not yet the capital of country music. Chicago was a very important town for country music. Radio was bigger than records at the time. And Chicago station WLS, which stands for World's Largest Store, Sears Roebuck, had a really, well, first of all, they blasted their signal very, very far. And they had a really popular country show. But they called it hillbilly music at the time. And Gene Autry was working at WLS radio station in Chicago in the late 1920s. He already started doing the cowboy shtick. And he was from the West. And here I'm showing his tailored look. These Mexican-inspired cowboy duds. He was a hillbilly singer, and then still singing the same kinds of hillbilly tunes. He brought forward a much more successful, saleable, marketable image, the singing cowboy rather than the singing hillbilly. And one historian has argued that he thereby rescued country music from what you could say was literally poor branding. And again, this is showing us the fancy cowboy, not the sweaty, muddy, mucked up with actual manure on the boots cowboy. And this is the charro, the fancy equestrian show rider and competitive rider from Mexico, the charro outfit here. with the embroidery, and sometimes some glitter. So, country music has given us many, many Western looks from the 1930s, starting with Gene Autry, up to the present moment. Lainey Wilson is one of the hottest country stars in this moment. And she introduced with Wrangler less than a year ago this, her own clothing collection. And you see her, she's wearing jeans. So this is not the charro. This is the working vaquero, cowboy, whenever they're wearing jeans. Now, Alan Jackson is mixing it up because he's got a kind of fancy jacket that's more charro, and he's wearing jeans which are more vaquero. Hank Williams has his cowboy look back in the 50s. And way back in the 1930s, besides Gene Autry, Patsy Montana, she had a big #1, or she had a big hit before the charts, in the pre-charts era, I Want to Be a Cowboy's Sweetheart. We would like it better if she had wanted to be her own cowgirl, I'm sure. But she had to do what would sell in the 1930s, right? So now we see both the vaquero, which maybe is best translated as cowpunch. This is someone who protects and herds the cattle, not someone who owns a hacienda in Mexico. Rugged and not fancy, and it involves denim. So let's go to the charro style and see that it doesn't come up only in country music. Guess what? It's Mexican, and it's used in Mexican popular music. Mariachi suits, that's what they are. The charro became a big hero in Mexico after playing an important role in the 19th century fight for independence from Spain. And when the charro became a national hero, that became the national costume. Eventually, also, charreria would become the national sport of Mexico. Had heroic, and it has very central nationalistic meanings in Mexico. So for us to assume that this is American, it gets deeper, right? So then the mariachis, naturally, it's such a proud look, they adopted the costume. And country music, country artists started in the 1940s and 50s also to adopt the very fancy look with not only embroidery and whole stories, right, told in the suit through the images, but glitter and spangles. And Manuel Cuevas, who is like Cher, just needs one name. He's just Manuel. Has been a very important designer. He first apprenticed to a tailor as a kid in Mexico. Then he moved to Los Angeles. He now has his own studio. He's in his 90s at this point and is still designing in Nashville. Manuel left his mark on what is, I would say, the most beautiful and profound suit of all. This one's in the Smithsonian now, I think. Unfortunately, Graham Parsons, as many of you know, overdosed after the poppies, pills, and pot leaf suit. He was a California Southern rocker who collaborated a lot with Emmylou Harris. This is by another important rodeo tailor, is how they call them in the United States, who also did his apprenticeship in Mexico, Jaime Castaneda. And this is the suit that Billy Ray Cyrus wore when he did the remix of Old Town Road to try to help a guy out when Lil Nas X was suffering so much racism in doing this cowboy song that was hitting #1 on the country charts. So, to leave those fabulous clothes for a minute, I go to the next section. So who says the West is wild? And who doesn't? Maybe even more importantly, who doesn't? So in my last book, Rednecks, Queers, and Country Music, at one point I quote 2 straight white male country music critics. One's conservative, one is progressive, but they both ridicule country music as corny and fake. Why? Because it includes songs about cowboys and ranches and livestock. They complain that these things have nothing to do with real life in the 21st century, and they point to them as evidence that country is phony and irrelevant. Okay, I think a lot of listeners maybe would agree with that assessment. So imagine my surprise when I start this book project. I go down to South Texas at the borderlands, and I get a bunch of Mexican American diehard country lovers together, and I ask them, what do you love about country music? And they say, one of the first things they say is, well, there's nothing that's more relatable to me as a Mexican American. And I say, why? What's relatable? Well, the cowboys and the ranches and the livestock. Right? So who's right here? Who's right? Depends on your point of view, right? Why is it relevant to them? Why is it so relatable? They all had family members and family histories that link to ranch work, for example. So they said, we love to see the pickup trucks in the music videos and in the song lyrics. We love to see, you know, all the cowboy hats and stuff. That's part of daily life. It's so relatable. So let's go through some of what they find relatable. I already mentioned that the charro became a figure of nationalism in Mexico in the 19th century, continues to hold that place in the culture in the 21st century. I just did graduation in my department at U of M this spring, and one of our Mexican-American graduates, her dad and brother were there in their cowboy hats and shirts and gear. Still in the 21st century, for dress-up occasions, for family reunions, for various kinds of occasions, the charro suit is iconically Mexican. And the cowboy is still a defining figure in contemporary Mexican popular music. There are many styles of música mexicana. These guys are currently huge because they had a really big collab with Bad Bunny in 2023, which some of you may know. Another kind of music that is música mexicana, well, Tejano is American because it's from Texas. Norteño, look how they're dressed. Caballo Dorado are the folks who did Achy Breaky Heart in Spanish. It's huge. Everybody, every wedding or quinceaños you could go to in Mexico, you put it on and people from toddlers to grannies are out on the floor and they know their steps. Duranguense, another style of music, a kind of banda. You see all these different cowboy styles, but they're all rocking the cowboy clothing. I get to do all the fun field work. Besides going to IGRA, I have been to a Chicago and Las Vegas weekend of it's a Spanish-speaking weekend-long event of queer cowboys, mostly gay men, but the community welcomes straight people who come to dance with their gay friends, and lesbians, especially masculine lesbians, who are also cowboys and rocking the cowboy gear. There are drag queens involved here too in the show. They're the MCs, making all the dirty jokes and keeping things lively. And I've written about the gay vaquero conventions. Here's the big one in Texas, which I have not been to yet. It's so big that they have different regional competitions, like semifinals in different Latina gay bars all around Texas, and then they all converge on Dallas to do the finals. And you see that year's winner, Rey Vaquero, king of the cowboys. Because there's a competition, a kind of a pageant-like competition. So, to return to my question, who says it's wild? And who doesn't? I hope that the answer to that is clearer now. It's a form of exoticism, right? To see Buffalo Bill, yeah, exciting, exhilarating. People would pay their hard-earned money to see that show. They called it brings the Wild West to you in just 3 hours. To us, that's wild. You know, and the term referred to other things about what was wild. People were going around shooting people. There were outlaws, et cetera, et cetera. But who doesn't see it as wild? Are the people for whom this is home culture. And so for people for whom the ranch and cowboy culture is original culture, home culture, such as my South Texas country music loving Mexican Americans. This isn't wild. This is relatable. It is wild for those who absorbed the culture and appropriated the culture as something exotic and then whitened it and straightened it and we could say colonized it. And so this is why I have brought in this buzzword, which is often so meaningless, but I want to say I mean the word with substance, right? That is the colonization of Mexican culture, all of that we call Western. My Western shirt maybe should be called vaquero shirt, right? And I'm going to be arguing in my book, Border Country, that, indeed, after Buffalo Bill, you might also think of those paintings by Frederick Remington, all the paintings of the West and the cowboys. You know, it was very fetishized. It was like this veiled homoerotic, fetishistic shtick, right? That men would love these cowboy movies and cowboy paintings that show a really, wow, look at the Marlboro Man selling all those cigarettes to butch, straight men with a really handsome, unfortunately, you know, future cancer victim. We know that about the guys who did the ads, unfortunately. Very fetishized, right? The cowboy. And the cowboy is very much a heroic, like sexy figure of macho in Mexico too. But he's there. He's originally their sexy fetish object, not ours. And he had national import. as part of their history of gaining independence from Spain and so on. So this is what I meant in my title when I said that I would try to present the Wild West decolonized and uncensored. Uncensored part is, of course, revealing the queerness of the cowboy. And now I would love to hear any questions or comments or thoughts you might share.
And let me walk on over with this microphone, because it is being live streamed. So folks got to hear you through this. And I get to do my daytime talk show host gig.
Yay.
I just want to say how much I love hearing that something that is so often a pillar of anti-immigrant sentiment is rooted so strongly in immigrant life and culture, and that's pretty badass.
Thank you, and that is why I'm really, really grateful to have won a fellowship that allows me to devote the entire year ahead to writing this book and finishing it as soon as possible without teaching as I would normally be doing, which is a very distracting business.
I think it's always interesting how European people reinvent themselves. So they could come from very poor family in England or Ireland, maybe be an indentured servant, but then they come to the US and they're a king and a queen, and they've always been rich, and they just reinvent themselves. And I think them becoming cowboys is, another reinvention. They can move from the East Coast to the West and become a totally different person.
Yeah, and of course, you wouldn't have wanted to do that until about 1899, right? Because the cowboy was just a disreputable figure. I've heard one scholar drew the comparison between cowboys were like ditch diggers or garbage men. But Buffalo Bill and the art of Frederick Remington turned the cowboy into, someone Americans would want to. Already in Mexico, the cowboy was a heroic figure, right? Yeah. My own people don't fit that, but I think I know what you're talking about, especially like historically the suburbanites. I mean, I come from working class folks, as I say, in Ohio, which is disreputable already in its own right. I can say that I teach at Michigan. But historically, when, for example, white middle-class people in the 1970s moved down into the suburbs of Atlanta, Birmingham, Alabama, and the new South that was called the Sun Belt South. They reinvented themselves and said, hey, I'm going to listen to country music, and I'm going to be a cowboy, and I'm going to go to a hoedown, and reinvent themselves in whatever figure might seem more fashionable, when in fact, sure, a lot of us, and as Toni Morrison has pointed out, there were the indentured, European indentured servants in the early years of this country.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I read Sarah Gailey's book like a month ago. It's not as fresh as if I had read it this week. And I appreciate a new framing, because that's not where I came into the book when I read it. I was curious about your personal response to the book, and how many traces of the Westernness that you immerse yourself in with your field work were you feeling in her book, or were they absent? And what did that personally mean to you in terms of the context?
So I want to echo Jacob's plug and say, I hope you'll come to the author talk and ask her to answer for her book. But, and I won't attempt to, but I will say this. The main thing that I thought I would connect up with, there were references that, certain people in her book were definitely unacceptable to the fascist powers that be, right? And that totally connects with these histories. The whole history of colonization started in Latin America. The colonizers were Spaniards, and Peru is where the Spaniards came in. They took the people they called savages, the indigenous people, who had actually developed an incredibly sophisticated culture, but not civilization, because civilization is this colonization. Civilization is colonization. And it started in the Spaniards taking the indigenous people and saying, oh, no, you're just running around here doing things, crossing boundaries, and this won't do. We're going to classify you. We're going to categorize you. So they imposed on them bureaucracy. Bureaucracy was the start of civilization. Some of you are male. Some of you are female. Let's get this straightened out. None of this gender bending. Some of you are this race and some of you are that race, and we've got to get this all classified. So the way that Sarah Gailey's story was showing that, like they called themselves librarians. Strategically, they called themselves librarians. And I'm not going to do any spoiler here, but there were certain categories under the bureaucracy of fascism that were dangerous ones to occupy. And then there are certain ones that you would want to present, at least, as if you belong to. So that process definitely resembles this process of like making John Wayne and Clint Eastwood into the representatives of the West. And of course, the librarians. When I look at that title, I didn't get the title at first. Upright Women Wanted. Well, you had the Handmaid's Tale folks' version of what an upright woman meant, their morality. And then you had these folks who called themselves the librarians. Their notion of what uprightness was, what a righteous work and righteous lives would look like. And, we're looking at the same thing now. People who see the resistance as something that is an upright endeavor, and others who are imposing certain forms of morality. I'm queer, and I think probably a lot of us in this audience are, and we know where we fall on that gradient of classification of the bureaucracy, the bureaucratic powers that be. So there is that connection, right? The current version of colonial bureaucracy. And then there's, this wonderful work that's done by my friends Rebecca Schofield and Alyssa Ford on the queer rural cowfolx, which shows that it's not only historical, it's also alive in the present day. That part, I think, connects pretty readily, right, with Gailey's novella. I don't know, does that answer your question? Okay.
This is slightly off topic from the literal subject of the talk, but I think still relevant. In thinking of the history of country music, you did a good job of pointing to its origins, in the West and then cowboy culture. But I think it's fairly inarguable that mainstream country, as it exists now, has moved kind of away from Western music and toward pop, and is now identified by outsiders and by people within the genre as residing largely in the South. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that and how that shift happened, and maybe a little bit of of what it means, and whether that's a shifting of our ideas about the West to our ideas about the South, or kind of how you view that. Because it seems like a pretty major shift despite the inarguable origins in the West and cowboy culture.
That's a great question, and that's part of my argument in my next book, in Border Country. So I want to say, first of all, the literal manifestation of this is in those jerks wearing trucker caps instead of cowboy hats. Another one, right? Yeah. The whole bro country. No, trucker caps are fine. But I mean, so my colleague Amanda Martinez, we just did a conference together out in LA where she talked about the trucker cap and which artists are wearing it and which ones they're wearing, and the whole evolution of that over the past 20 years, or I don't know, maybe 25, replacing the cowboy hat. So that's just right in your face, literal illustration of your point. And I want to mention another thing. I briefly alluded to how Nashville wasn't always the capital of country music. So, as I said, country music started out being called hillbilly music. In my phrasing, and this is what I'll be writing in my book, the genre was saddled with literally poor branding. Mexican culture in the form of the cowboy rescued the genre, because then the singing cowboy came forward, became the most popular and visible sort of face of country music. And then we had World War II, right? Because that was mostly in the 1930s, the singing cowboy movies and the singing cowboy, the songs. They got slotted under hillbilly music, weirdly enough, right? Or not weirdly, because they were hillbilly songs sung by people in hats. Then World War II happened, and people, were really focused on other things. But after World War II, and understandably, after World War II, the name of the genre was changed from hillbilly to country and Western. Then the word itself, Western, got dropped. When? After Nashville took over. And so then you get these critics who are saying things like, how relevant is the song? Biggest song of the entire decade of the 1990s, Toby Keith's Should Have Been a Cowboy, right? And then who's he singing about? He's actually singing about Gene and Roy. He's singing about the silver screen cowboys, right? It's a nostalgia song. But that was the most played country song of the entire decade of the 1990s. And these critics in the 2000s were saying, where's the relevance? This music is so fake and phony. But, and yeah, I get what they're saying. It is a lot more relevant to Mexican American listeners who actually have connections in real life to rancho life and know where the heck these boots and these shirts come from. But Nashville in 1958, in the 50s is when Nashville took over country music, made itself into the capital of the industry. And in 1958, the Country Music Association was formed. That's a trade group. And they were, moving the levers of power, doing marketing research and all those things that industry trade groups do. And they shifted over the themes of country music to become more Southern, as you said, Southeastern. And hillbilly music started out not even particularly Southeastern. It had a lot of the artists were Southeastern, but it was a lot about family and life, and it didn't name check cities or towns the way that country does now to really, really say, hey, we're Southeastern, we're Southern, right?
Did hillbilly music start in Appalachia?
So that's another thing, and right, one of the interventions of my book will be to contribute to the sort of thing that Cowboy Carter has done, which is to say, no, this music is not just like Irish and English fiddle songs that have evolved. That was the legend. That was the story of country music. Country music, of course, was hugely influenced by African American musicians. And we've had more scholarship and even journalistic work recognizing that. I'm also going to be arguing that there's a big dose of Mexican influence right at the heart of the genre. And Nashville, 70s and 80s is when we dropped the word Western from country and Western. So I guess what I'm saying about those two critics who I keep spanking is that perhaps they can be forgiven, since after all, the genre had turned away from its Western identity. Perhaps they can be forgiven for saying this is irrelevant, because they were young enough probably not even to have known country music when it was called country and Western. That got dropped pretty much after the 70s and 80s. Sort of disappeared. And so what does that do? For my purposes, it also disappears the Mexican influence all the further, it buries it deeper. If Western was a proxy for Mexican, as I'm arguing. In that, I'm not saying writ large everywhere that whenever you see the word Western, it means Mexican, but I'm saying in country music, that's what it represented.
And I saw another hand. This will be our last question, Ian.
I just want to ask, how does Chapel Rowan tie into this? Because, or does she not at all?
How does she not tie into everything? I'm going to have to think, though. Chapel Roan. So we start off by talking about Pink Pony Club. And that pony, I don't know, it's a strip club, and I don't know what that has to do with anything. Pony might sound as if it's to do with our themes today, but it's more the country song. I'm spacing on the name of it. She did it on SNL.
The Giver?
Yeah, The Giver, which is really about cunnilingus, of course. And then everybody said, she's done a country song. And it actually went to #1 on the country charts. Chapel Roan, of all people. With those cartoon bears behind it. That was a really hilarious moment in pop culture history, wasn't it? What Chapel Roan has to do with it is partly, and y'all may have ideas about this too, but I loved how her band was so retro Western. They were going back to, and Chapel Roan, bless her heart, I have known so many music students like her. She's such a little musical theater geek, right? She knows her musical theater history and can really do retro like few artists of her generation. She has a deeper knowledge of that imagery and those histories. And her band, her all-woman band, looked fabulous in their light blue gingham check outfits at that SNL live premiere of the song. And the whole notion of what country sounds like was more of a country western notion in certain ways. There's a big old rock guitar solo in there. It's a hybrid stylistically, but it's also an older notion even of what country sounds like. What country sounds like today, right? From all those guys in their trucker hats who really rule the roost, has everything to do with late 90s and 2000s pop rap. Many of the top 20 songs, we talk more about top 20 in country than top 40 because, rotation on radio, you're going to hear the same song several times a day if it's up in the top 20. They don't mind repeating songs unless a woman sang them. Then they really mind. Never play them back to back, the guy said, who started Tomatogate scandal. But I just interrupted myself one time too many. Where did I start this?
90s pop.
Thank you. So late 90s, 2000s rap. Now, the bro dudes who are at the top of the game in country music now, they may be singing, but they're delivering a flow. It's been a long time since top 20 country did not sound like a flow. That's been happening throughout most of the 21st century. That country is really heavily influenced, not by sort of culturally conscious, woke hip hop, but I would say pop rap, top 40 rap. You hear the flow.
Oh, yeah. I've said the same thing, actually.
Because it's true.
Pop
It's
rap
why you said it.
With an accent, yeah.
Pop rap with an accent. Yeah. Morgan Wallen. Right.
I like some of his songs, though, and it makes me hate myself.
I mean, he did really well on, was it The Voice or the other one? I mean, he's talented. Yeah, so there's no question about that.
Well, let's give Dean a round of applause.
Thank you so much. Those were fabulous questions, really smart questions. And thanks for being here.